The Diary of Dr. X. 30. The latest climate change fiasco. There has been a lot of superficial movement on the climate change front recently. Some of it national, some of it international as I write this in the fall of 2014. I call it a fiasco as a result of the unscientific language even well-meaning individuals and institutions continue to use regarding this topic. On the local front, Dr. David Suzuki, longtime host of the CBC primetime science show The Nature of Things, has launched a campaign called the Blue Dot Tour. This could, if he is successful, leave a major legacy before he dies, as he is quite elderly at this point. The blue dot is a reference to the planet Earth, the only known planet that nourishes life in this universe that is known to science. You might think that might make it pretty precious, right? His campaign is quite ambitious, as befits the final campaign of a national icon like himself. He wants, and I quote, the right to a healthy environment to be enshrined in the Canadian Constitution, no less. The strategy is to move up from the grassroots, beginning with municipal and civic institutions, which will put pressure on provincial institutions to do the same, which will in turn pressure the federal government itself to make the final move of altering the Constitution of Canada. There is movement in other countries along similar lines, he says. And as my connections in the street tell me, even efforts to get the same enshrined internationally by reopening the Geneva Convention. That's from a friend named Alan, whose daughter moves in those circles and lives just up the street from me. All admirable, right? Well, yes. But you notice the problem with the language here, as mentioned? If you've been following along, you would know, particularly from my chapter, Why I'm Not an Environmentalist, that the environment is not a living thing. It is a physical context in which life happens. So it cannot be healthy in and of itself, as Dr. Suzuki's language implies. It can only be healthy for living things, for human life, for ecosystems, for the biosphere itself. And the health of the latter, the biosphere, is a real issue from a scientific perspective. But let's cut Dr. Suzuki a little slack for a moment. After all, he means well. The only problem is he spent his entire career as a spokesman for the environmental perspective in the CCCP media, where he was forbidden to talk about actual green philosophy and its radical implications for fear of losing his job, assuming for a moment he actually knew anything about it. An understandable reason why he wouldn't insist on the inclusion of a right to a sustainable biosphere in the Constitution in order to use scientific language, which CCCP lawyers can't challenge probably successfully the moment the Constitution is changed using sound scientific arguments besides. Well, good luck, Dr. Suzuki, sincerely, but with the language you have chosen to promote, I believe you will need it, not necessarily in terms of achieving your goal. That may well happen, since it's consistent with the CCP agenda, but in terms of it meaning anything over the long term, which I would assume is what you want. The same is true of the international news I awoke to read in the local newspaper today. On the surface, it appeared to be really good news. You see, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, an international group of scientists who are experts on the issue made a major announcement in the fourth and final installment of their most recent report to the world on that issue, climate change. These are the same folks who provided the scientific information to form the Kyoto Protocol on climate change a couple decades back, with that document setting targets for reductions about 5 to 10 times below what IPCC actually recommended, if I recall correctly. Good benchmark to how our psychopathic social institutions react to scientific data based on their past history. This time, IPCC's message makes no bones about the extent of the problem. They now suggest that emissions from the burning of fossil fuels may need to drop to 0 before the end of the century to prevent irreversible impacts on people and the environment, unfortunately. Once again, as though the environment can be harmed. And yes, thankfully, they actually acknowledge not only global warming as a problem, as I have previously, but also a warmer and more acidic ocean, which I have identified as the primary threat to the destruction of the biosphere. That is, life on Earth, not the environment. From the continued massive global utilization of fossil fuels. The environment, you see, will be just fine no matter how acidic or carbon-filled it becomes, because quite simply, it is already dead. But the CCCP media absolutely refuses to speak in ecological terms. And why? In order to avoid the radical implications the real green literature has always contained concerning social issues. And the IPCC does it yet again, as they state, and I quote, shifting the energy system to solar and wind power and other renewable energy sources, which I will be arguing for in an episode or two, and I continue to quote, would reduce economic growth by only 0.06% annually. Where the hell they get that stat from is beyond me. I haven't had the opportunity to review their document because I was out collecting cigarette butts and beer cans today. But it is pretty clear that they continue to refuse to question the central religion of our age, namely the utmost importance of economic growth at all costs and damn the consequences to everything else. And this, if you recall, is the real root cause of the ecological crisis, as I have repeated many times. Fossil fuel use, despite its obvious ecological impacts, is a symptom of the problem. And yes, needs to be dealt with immediately, just as they suggest. The belief in the possibility of continuous economic growth on a finite and ecologically fragile planet, on the other hand, is a disease and the root cause of the ecological crisis. It's analogous to cancer, in fact. It is also the main reason why fossil fuels, despite their ecological destructiveness, remain so attractive as the main driver of economic growth, in two ways in particular. One, through the expansion of the global production and distribution system, or the CCCP system, and the massive amount of wasted transportation it implies as compared to local production for local use as ecology recommends due to its greater efficiency. Two, through the promotion of the expansion of a transportation system based on private automobiles rather than public transit, which is the most wasteful system imaginable from the perspective of ecological efficiency. This is why its expansion has always been the driver, in fact, the cornerstone of the expansion of the industrial economy, because it is a completely inefficient resource consumption pig and consistent with the philosophy of overconsumption, which the CCCP psychopaths have always promoted. And as usual, the environmentalists, both locally and internationally, and however well-meaning, continue to tell us what CCCP institutions want to hear, rather than what we, as a species, need to hear in order to avert the ecological crisis. And to survive, if you haven't heard. And why? Because science has not only been co-opted by the CCCP agenda, which now largely funds its research, but has become a handmaiden of the dominant economic religion of our age. A pretty sad state of affairs for an enterprise, science that is, which was supposedly founded upon the dominance of reason and evidence. Sorry to say, but unfortunately, all too true in the present age. Shot a ride of that, but no cheers. Sorry. Night.